Hashtag after 50,000 years, an ancient human awakens on an alien desert world. Leading 10,000 warriors, the sand shifted beneath weathered stone as consciousness slowly returned to Marcus Chun. His eyes opened to a crimson sky painted with two dying suns, their fading light casting long shadows across an endless desert wasteland. The taste of copper and ancient dust filled his mouth as he struggled to sit up, his body feeling both impossibly heavy and strangely light at the same time. Marcus had been sleeping for 50,000 years. The memories came flooding back in waves that threatened to drown him. Earth's final days. The Covenant War that had torn apart the galaxy. The desperate last stand at Terra's moon. The experimental stasis pods designed to preserve humanity's greatest warriors for a future when they might be needed again. He remembered the choice he had made, the sacrifice of stepping into that crystalline chamber while Earth burned behind him. Now he was here, wherever here was. The pod that had protected him for millennia lay broken around him, its energy core finally depleted after keeping him in perfect suspension. The technology was beyond anything his era had possessed, built by allies whose names he could barely remember through the fog of temporal displacement. As his vision cleared, Marcus saw them. Thousands upon thousands of figures moving through the desert like living shadows. They were not human, yet they carried themselves with a familiar discipline that spoke of military training. Their forms were tall and lean, adapted for this harsh world, with skin that seemed to shimmer between bronze and gold in the dying light. One of them approached him with careful steps, keeping what appeared to be a weapon lowered but ready. The being's face was angular, almost crystalline in structure, with eyes that held depths of intelligence, and something that looked remarkably like hope. Ancient One. The creature spoke in a language that somehow Marcus understood, though he had never heard it before. You have awakened. The prophecy told us this day would come, when the desert would give up its greatest treasure and the sleeper would rise to lead us against the darkness. Marcus struggled to his feet, his enhanced physiology quickly adapting to the different gravity and atmospheric conditions. His body had been augmented with the best technology available during humanity's golden age, making him stronger, faster, and more resilient than baseline humans. Even after 50 millennia in stasis, he felt his strength returning with each breath. Who are you? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. What is this place? The being straightened with obvious pride. I am Zarakai, first spear of the 10th Legion of Kepler, 442b. We are the Kalari, children of this world that your ancestors once called Hope's End. And you, Ancient One, are the fulfillment of the promise made to our people when the stars still sang of human glory. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. 50,000 years. Humanity had spread to the stars, established colonies, touched alien civilizations. His species had grown beyond Earth's boundaries in ways he had never imagined possible. But something had gone wrong. The way Zarakai spoke of human glory in past tense suggested that the Golden Age had ended. Where are the humans now? Marcus asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Zarakai's expression darkened, and she gestured toward the horizon where strange structures jutted from the sand like the bones of dead giants. Gone, Ancient One, lost to the great silence that fell across the galaxy 10,000 years ago. The void touched came from beyond the rim, consuming worlds and civilizations like a plague of living shadow. Humanity fought longer and harder than any species before them, but even they could not stand against the infinite hunger. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Humanity extinct. The thought should have crushed him, should have driven him to his knees in despair. Instead, he felt a familiar warmth building in his core, the same fire that had burned in him during humanity's darkest hours. If his species was gone, then someone had to carry on their legacy. Someone had to stand against the darkness and show the galaxy what human determination truly meant. You said something about 10,000 warriors, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "Tell me about your legions." Zarakai's eyes lit up with fierce pride. "We are the descendants of the human colony that settled this world. Over the millennia, we adapted, evolved, but we never forgot the teachings of our ancestors. We maintained their military traditions, their tactical doctrines, their refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. When the void touch came for our world, we went underground, literally and figuratively." She pointed toward what Marcus had taken for natural rock formations in the distance. Now he could see they were carefully constructed defensive positions, built into the living rock of the desert mesas. "We have fought a guerrilla war for 10,000 years, Ancient One. Hit and run attacks, sabotage, assassination. We have bled the enemy with 1,000 cuts, but we cannot drive them from our world. We lack the numbers, the heavy weapons, the coordination needed for a true offensive. But the prophecy spoke of one who would come, one who carried the tactical genius of ancient Terra in his mind and the fire of human ambition in his heart." Marcus looked out across the desert, seeing it now with different eyes. This wasn't just a wasteland. It was a battlefield that had been contested for 10 millennia. Every rock formation could hide a sniper's nest. Every canyon could channel an enemy advance into a killing field. The Kalari had been fighting longer than human civilization had existed when he went into stasis. "Show me your warriors," Marcus said. "Show me what I have to work with." Zarakai raised her hand and made a complex gesture. Immediately, the desert around them came alive. Warriors emerged from concealed positions that Marcus's enhanced eyes hadn't even detected. They moved with fluid grace, their weapons held with the casual competence of soldiers who had known nothing but war their entire lives. They were magnificent. Each one bore the lean, efficient build of a natural predator, but their equipment and bearing spoke of discipline that went beyond mere survival instinct. Their armor was a patchwork of salvage technology and ingenious adaptations, but it was well-maintained and fitted perfectly to each warrior's frame. Their weapons ranged from advanced energy rifles that hummed with barely contained power to simple but deadly blades that gleamed with molecular sharpness. 10,000, Marcus asked. 10,012, if you include the command structure, Zarakai confirmed. Organized into 10 legions of 1,000 each, with specialized units for reconnaissance, heavy assault, engineering, and support. We have maintained the old ways, the human ways, even as we adapted to this world and its unique challenges. Marcus felt a smile tugging at his lips, the first genuine expression of joy he had felt since awakening. 10,000 warriors who had spent 10 millennia learning to fight against impossible odds. Descendants of humans who had inherited not just their ancestors' tactical genius, but had refined it through generations of constant warfare. This wasn't just an army. It was a weapon forged in the crucible of galactic war and tempered by 10,000 years of conflict. "Tell me about the enemy," he said. "These void touched. What are their capabilities, their weaknesses, their deployment patterns?" Zarakai's expression grew grim. "They're not like any enemy your ancestors faced, Ancient One. They consume matter and energy, converting it into more of themselves. They learn, adapt, grow stronger with each victory. Traditional weapons are largely ineffective against their primary forms, though we have developed some countermeasures over the millennia." She gestured, and several warriors stepped forward carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum of exotic technology. Quantum disruptors that interfere with their molecular cohesion. Psi dampeners that block their hive mind communications. Temporal mines that create localized time distortions. We have learned to wound them, even kill their smaller forms, but their numbers seem limitless. Numbers, Marcus mused. Always comes down to numbers in the end. How many are we facing? On this world, perhaps 50,000 of their warrior forms, backed by an unknown number of support entities. They control the major cities, the industrial centers, the spaceport. We estimate their total force at somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 depending on how many dormant forms they keep in reserve. Marcus did the mathematics in his head. 10,000 against 500,000. In conventional warfare, those odds would be suicide. But conventional warfare had died with Earth, apparently. This called for something different, something that would honor his ancestors while adapting to the realities of this new age. I need to see their deployment, he said. Study their patrol patterns, understand their logistics. And I need to know everything about your capabilities. Everything your people have learned in 10,000 years of warfare. It will take time to gather all the intelligence, Zarakai warned. And the enemy has grown suspicious of our activities in recent cycles. They are preparing for something, mobilizing forces we have not seen before. Then, we don't have much time, Marcus replied. Gather your Legion commanders. I want to meet with them before the next dawn. And prepare your best scouts. I want reconnaissance reports from every major enemy position within 100 kilometers. As the Kalari warriors began to disperse to carry out his orders, Marcus felt the familiar weight of command settling onto his shoulders. It was a burden he had carried for humanity during their darkest hours, and now he would carry it for these descendants who had kept the flame of human determination burning across 50 millennia. He looked up at the alien stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of these two dying suns, the galaxy continued its ancient dance. But here, on this desert world that had once been called Hope's End, something new was beginning. Marcus Chun, last son of Terra, had awakened to find himself in command of an army that existed because humanity had never learned to surrender. The void touched had conquered the galaxy, consumed civilizations, and brought darkness to 1,000 worlds. But they had never faced 10,000 warriors trained in the human way of war, led by a man who had personally overseen the defense of Earth itself. The enemy had controlled this world for 10,000 years. Marcus intended to change that in considerably less time. As night fell over the desert, he began to plan their first real offensive in a century of hiding. The Kalari had fought a defensive war for 10 millennia, striking from the shadows and fading back into the wasteland. That was about to change. It was time to remind the galaxy why humans had once been feared across 1,000 star systems. It was time to show these void-touched what happened when you woke a sleeping Terran. The war council met in the depths of Mount Keth-Moran, a massive mesa that the Kalari had hollowed out over centuries to create a fortress that could house their entire army. Marcus followed Zarakai through corridors carved from living rock, past chambers filled with workshops, armories, training grounds, and living spaces that spoke of a people who had made war their entire way of life. The command center was a marvel of adapted technology. Holographic displays showed the movements of enemy forces across the planet's surface, while banks of monitoring equipment tracked everything from atmospheric conditions to quantum resonance patterns that might betray void-touch presence. It was a fusion of human military doctrine and alien innovation that impressed even Marcus's enhanced intellect. The 10 Legion commanders were already assembled when he arrived. Each one bore the scars of decades of warfare, their faces marked by the kind of tired determination that came from fighting a war that seemed impossible to win. They studied him with expressions that mixed hope and skepticism in equal measure. Brothers and sisters, Zarakai addressed the group. I present Marcus Chun, the Ancient One, last commander of Terra's defense. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, a grizzled warrior with cybernetic implants replacing his left arm stepped forward. Marcus could see the man was old even by Kalari standards, his bronze skin weathered by decades of desert combat. I am Thekron, commander of the 1st Legion, he said. With respect, Ancient One, we have heard the prophecies all our lives. We have been told that one would come who would lead us to victory against the void-touched. But prophecies do not win wars. Tactics do. Strategy does. The kind of military genius that can take 10,000 warriors and make them into something that can challenge an enemy that outnumbers us 50 to 1. Marcus nodded approvingly. He would have been disappointed in anything less than direct challenge from experienced commanders. You're right to question me, Thekron. Prophecies are just words until someone proves them true through action. So let me ask you this. In 10,000 years of warfare, how many major victories have you achieved against the void touched? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus could see the answer in their faces before anyone spoke. We have won many engagements, said a female commander with ritual scarification covering half her face. Ambushes, raids, surgical strikes. We have cost them thousands of their warrior forms over the centuries. But no decisive victories, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. No actions that fundamentally changed the strategic situation. You've been fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that can replace losses faster than you can inflict them. What would you have us do? Thekron's voice carried an edge of frustration. We are 10,000 against 500,000. We lack heavy weapons, orbital support, numerical superiority. We do what we can with what we have. Marcus walked to the central holographic display, studying the enemy positions marked in red across the planetary map. 3 major cities under void-touched control. Industrial complexes that had been converted to production facilities for their biomechanical warriors. A spaceport that allowed them to communicate with and receive reinforcements from their forces elsewhere in the galaxy. You're thinking like defenders, Marcus said. Like people who are trying to survive until help arrives. But help isn't coming. Humanity is gone. The other species have either been consumed or have gone into hiding. There's no cavalry riding to our rescue. He turned to face the assembled commanders, and they could see something in his eyes that had been absent from their own for far too long. The absolute certainty of victory. So we don't defend. We attack. We take this planet back, one strategic objective at a time. And then we use this world as a base to begin the reconquest of the galaxy. The silence that followed was broken by what might have been laughter from one of the younger commanders. Ancient One, with respect, that's not tactics. That's fantasy. We cannot take defended positions against an entrenched enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority. Can't we? Marcus manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on the largest enemy city. Tell me about their force distribution. How do they organize their defenses? Zarakai stepped forward, her fingers dancing over the control interface. The display shifted, showing detailed intelligence on enemy positions. They maintain a central command cluster here, in what was once our planetary capital. Approximately 10,000 warrior forms, plus support entities. The city is surrounded by sensor networks and automated defenses. 3 major access routes, all heavily fortified, and their patrol patterns? Predictable, Thekron admitted. They have not needed to vary them in centuries. We lack the numbers to threaten their major positions directly. Marcus nodded, beginning to see the shape of the enemy's weakness. Complacency. 10,000 years of unchallenged control has made them predictable. They're not fighting a war anymore. They're maintaining an occupation. He highlighted several positions on the display. These industrial complexes. What do they produce? Warrior forms, primarily, replied the scarred female commander. Biomechanical constructs that serve as their primary military units. Also support drones, maintenance systems, communication relays. And if those facilities were destroyed, their ability to replace losses would be severely compromised, Zarakai said, her eyes beginning to show understanding. But, Ancient One, those facilities are heavily defended. Each one has at least 5,000 warrior forms protecting it. 5,000 defenders spread across how large an area? The primary facility covers approximately 50 square kilometers. Marcus smiled, and several of the commanders felt a chill despite the warmth of the underground chamber. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. 50 square kilometers defended by 5,000 troops. That's 1 defender per hectare, assuming perfect distribution. In reality, they're clustered around key installations, leaving vast areas with minimal coverage. Tell me about their night vision capabilities. Limited, Thekron said slowly. They rely primarily on thermal and electromagnetic sensors. Our intelligence suggests they have difficulty with visual identification in low-light conditions, and their response time to alarm conditions variable. In the cities, very fast. At the industrial sites, slower. Perhaps 10 to 15 minutes to coordinate a meaningful response. Marcus was already formulating the assault plan in his mind, drawing on decades of experience in asymmetric warfare. The Kalari had been thinking defensively for so long that they couldn't see the opportunities that their own intelligence revealed. "We're going to hit all 3 industrial facilities simultaneously," he announced. "Quick strikes, maximum damage, extract before they can coordinate a response." "Ancient One," Zarakai said carefully, "that would require splitting our forces. 3 separate assaults, each against a heavily defended target. Even if we committed our entire army, we could only field approximately 3,000 warriors per target." "Who said anything about committing our entire army?" Marcus replied. "We're going to use 1/10 of our total force. 1,000 warriors, divided into 3 strike forces. The remaining 9,000 will be engaged in diversionary operations across the planet." The commanders exchanged glances that suggested they thought their ancient savior might have awakened with some form of temporal dementia. 1,000 warriors against 3 facilities defended by 15,000 enemy troops total. Thekron's voice was carefully controlled. "Ancient One, perhaps you could explain the tactical reasoning behind this approach." Marcus highlighted different sections of the planetary map, showing patrol routes, communication relays, sensor networks, and supply lines that the Kalari had spent millennia cataloging. The enemy's strength is also their weakness. They're spread thin across the entire planet, maintaining occupation of every significant population center and resource site. They've been fighting ghosts for 10,000 years, never facing a coordinated assault on multiple fronts. When we hit them, they're going to panic and try to reinforce everything at once. He traced communication lines across the display. Their response doctrine is centralized. Each facility will call for help, and the central command will try to coordinate a response. But here's what they don't know. We're not trying to hold territory. We're not trying to occupy their positions. We're going to destroy their production capability and disappear back into the desert. The scarred commander leaned forward, studying the plan with professional interest. Hit and run, but coordinated across multiple targets simultaneously. Force them to spread their response across too many fronts to be effective anywhere. Exactly. While they're scrambling to respond to 3 industrial facility attacks, our diversionary forces will be hitting supply convoys, communication relays, and isolated outposts across the planet. They'll have dozens of simultaneous emergencies to deal with, and not enough forces to respond to all of them effectively. Marcus manipulated the display again, showing timing sequences. Each strike team has exactly 30 minutes on target. Get in, plant charges on critical production equipment, eliminate key personnel if possible, and extract. The diversionary attacks begin 15 minutes before the main assault and continue for 2 hours after. By the time the enemy realizes what our primary objectives were, we'll be back in the deep desert, and their production capacity will be crippled for months. Thekron was studying the plan with the intensity of a man who had spent his entire life learning to find flaws in military operations. "It could work," he said slowly, "but it requires perfect timing, flawless execution, and assumes that our intelligence about enemy response times is accurate. It also assumes we can get our strike teams into position without being detected," added another commander. "These facilities have sensor networks that cover approaches from multiple directions." Marcus nodded. "Which brings us to the weapons and equipment modifications we're going to need. Zarakai, you mentioned that your people have developed quantum disruptors and psi dampeners over the centuries. I want to know everything about your stealth technology, your explosives, and your extraction capabilities." For the next several hours, the The commanders briefed him on 10,000 years of technological adaptation. The Kalari had become experts at guerrilla warfare, developing equipment and techniques specifically designed for fighting against a technologically superior enemy. Their stealth suits could bend electromagnetic radiation, making the wearer effectively invisible to most sensor systems. Their explosives were designed to cause maximum damage to void-touched biomechanical systems while remaining stable under extreme conditions. Their communication equipment used quantum entanglement to prevent interception. Most importantly, they had learned to think like their enemy. 10 millennia of studying void-touched tactics, psychology, and operational patterns had given them insights that no other species possessed. "We know how they think," Zarakai explained. "They're efficient, logical, but not creative. They respond to threats in predictable patterns because their hive mind nature makes them excellent at coordination, but poor at improvisation." "Show me their tactical doctrine," Marcus requested. The holographic display shifted to show recorded footage of void-touched responses to previous Kalari attacks. Marcus watched with growing satisfaction as the enemy demonstrated exactly the kind of rigid, centralized response patterns that he could exploit. "They're fighting the last war," he murmured. "Probably the last 10 wars. They've optimized their tactics for fighting conventional forces using conventional strategies. They have no experience dealing with coordinated, unconventional attacks. Because no one has been able to coordinate such attacks," Thekron pointed out. "The logistics alone require a level of organization and communication that most resistance movements can't achieve." "But we're not a resistance movement," Marcus replied. "We're a professional army that's been practicing unconventional warfare for 10,000 years. You have the skills. You have the equipment. You have the intelligence. What you've lacked is someone with experience in planning operations of this scale and complexity." He stood up, addressing all the commanders at once. "I want operational plans for the diversionary attacks within 6 hours. Target priorities, team assignments, timing sequences, extraction routes. I want weapons and equipment inventories for all strike teams. And I want detailed terrain analysis for all approach routes to the industrial facilities." "Ancient One," Zarakai said, "when do you intend to execute this operation?" Marcus looked at the chronometer display, showing the planet's rotational cycle. 72 hours from now. 3 days to plan, prepare, and position our forces. The enemy has had 10,000 years to get comfortable. It's time to remind them that this war isn't over." The commanders began to disperse to carry out their assignments, but Thekron remained behind. "Ancient One, may I speak freely?" "Always. This plan is either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. But I've been fighting this war for 67 years, and I've never seen anything like the confidence you're showing. Where does it come from?" Marcus looked at the holographic display, still showing enemy positions across the planet. "It comes from knowing that humans never learned how to surrender, Thekron. Your people have spent 10,000 years proving that every single day in every single engagement with the enemy. You've kept the flame burning when every other species in the galaxy gave up or died trying." He turned to face the old warrior. "I'm not here to teach you how to fight. You already know how to do that better than almost any soldiers I've ever commanded. I'm here to teach you how to win. And the first step in winning is believing that victory is possible." As Thekron left to join his fellow commanders in planning the operation, Marcus remained alone in the command center, studying the intelligence displays. 50,000 years he had slept while the galaxy fell into darkness. But darkness was just the absence of light, and he had awakened to find himself surrounded by warriors who carried the brightest flame of all, the unquenchable human refusal to accept defeat. In 72 hours, the Void Touch were going to learn what that flame could do when it was properly directed. The assault began exactly as planned, under the cover of the planet's deepest night when both suns had set and only the stars provided illumination. Marcus watched from the command center as tactical displays showed his forces moving into position across a 1,000-kilometer front. 333 warriors per strike team, each group approaching their assigned industrial facility through carefully scouted routes that avoided the heaviest sensor coverage. The remaining forces were spread across the planet, preparing to execute 17 different diversionary attacks that would convince the enemy they were facing a general uprising rather than a coordinated assault on specific targets. First diversionary element in position, reported Kethmar, the communications specialist who had been assigned to coordinate the operation. Supply convoy ambush prepared. Marcus nodded, watching the chronometer count down the final minutes. Timing was everything in an operation like this. Too early, and the enemy would have time to coordinate their response. Too late, and the strike teams would lose the element of surprise. Strike Team Alpha reports ready. Zarakai's voice came through the quantum communicator. She was leading the assault on the primary industrial facility, the largest and most heavily defended of the three targets. Stealth fields active, charges armed, extraction routes confirmed. Strike Team Beta ready, came to report from Thekron, who had insisted on leading one of the assault teams despite Marcus's suggestion that his experience would be more valuable in overall coordination. Strike Team Gamma ready, reported Volterra, the youngest of the Legion commanders and a specialist in high-tech warfare. Marcus studied the tactical displays one final time. Everything was in position. Hundreds of warriors hidden in the desert, waiting for the signal to begin the largest coordinated operation in Kalari history. Begin diversionary phase, Marcus ordered. Across the planet, 17 different Kalari strike teams launched simultaneous attacks on supply convoys, communication relays, and isolated outposts. The response was immediate and exactly as predicted. Emergency signals flooded the void-touched communication networks as their central command tried to assess the scope of what appeared to be a planet-wide coordinated uprising. Marcus watched the enemy response patterns on his displays. Troop movements began immediately, with forces from the three major cities deploying to investigate and respond to the diversionary attacks. It was exactly the kind of distributed response he had hoped for. Enemy forces moving to respond to perimeter attacks, Kethmar reported. Central Command appears to be treating this as a general insurrection. Perfect. Maintain diversionary pressure for exactly 15 minutes, then begin primary assault phase. The minutes crawled by as Marcus watched his carefully laid plans unfold across the planet. The Void-Touched were responding exactly as their tactical doctrine dictated, sending rapid response teams to every point of contact while keeping reserve forces in defensive positions around their key installations. Marcus said as the chronometer reached the planned assault time. All strike teams execute primary objectives. 300 kilometers to the north, Zarakai led her team through a gap in the sensor network that intelligence had identified weeks earlier. The primary industrial facility sprawled across the desert like a mechanical cancer, its biomechanical production lines working constantly to manufacture the warrior forms that kept the Void-Touched in control of the planet. Her warriors moved like shadows through the facility's outer perimeter, their stealth suits rendering them effectively invisible to the automated security systems. The plan called for them to plant demolition charges on the primary fusion reactors that powered the production lines, then fight their way to the central control complex to eliminate the facility's command staff. Thermal charges placed on Reactor 1, reported her demolition specialist through the team's short-range communication network. Charges set on Reactor 2, came another report. Zarakai herself was leading a small team toward the control complex, where intelligence suggested they would find the Void-Touched commanders responsible for coordinating production across all three facilities. If they could eliminate the senior leadership, it would take the enemy weeks or months to restore full operational capacity. The control complex was a towering spire of dark metal and biomechanical interfaces that pulsed with the same diseased light that characterized all Void-Touched technology. Zarakai felt the familiar revulsion that all Kalari experienced when forced to enter enemy installations, but she pushed it aside to focus on the mission. Guards eliminated, reported her infiltration team. Path to command center is clear. Meanwhile, 200 kilometers to the east, Thekron was discovering that the enemy's response to the diversionary attacks was even more pronounced than their intelligence had predicted. The secondary industrial facility was operating with reduced security as guards were pulled away to respond to the apparent general uprising. "This is almost too easy," he muttered to his second-in-command as they placed demolition charges on critical manufacturing equipment. 10,000 years of careful defensive planning, and they abandoned their positions the moment they think they're facing a real threat. "Do not question good fortune," his lieutenant replied. The Ancient One predicted this response. "Trust in his tactical analysis." Thekron nodded, but part of him remained skeptical. 50,000 years of stasis could not have prepared Marcus for the specific tactical realities of fighting the Void Touched. Yet so far, every prediction he had made about enemy response patterns was proving accurate. At the third facility, Velterra was leading her team through the most technically challenging part of the operation. This installation was responsible for producing the communication and sensor equipment that kept the Void Touch command network functioning. Destroying it would blind the enemy for months, but the facility was protected by advanced defensive systems that required careful neutralization. "Quantum disruptors in position," she reported to her technical team. "Beginning interference pattern that should mask our approach." The disruptors were one of the Kalari's most sophisticated weapons, devices that could interfere with the molecular cohesion of Void Touch technology. They had taken decades to develop and required rare materials that were difficult to obtain in the quantities needed for large-scale operations. "Defensive grid is fluctuating," her electronics specialist reported. "We have a window of approximately 6 minutes before the system compensates for our interference." "Move fast," Velterra ordered. "Get those charges placed and get out." Back in the command center, Marcus was watching all three operations unfold simultaneously while monitoring the enemy's overall response to the diversionary attacks. The Void Touch Central Command was clearly struggling to coordinate their response to what appeared to be the largest coordinated assault they had faced in centuries. Enemy forces are pulling back from 12 of 17 diversionary targets, Kethmar reported. They appear to be concentrating their response on the 5 largest engagements. Understood. Signal diversionary teams to intensify pressure on those 5 targets while maintaining harassment operations at the others. Make them think those 5 locations are our primary objectives. The beauty of the plan was that even if the enemy figured out the true nature of the operation, they couldn't respond effectively without abandoning either their diversionary commitments or their defense of the industrial facilities. They simply didn't have enough forces to do both effectively. Strike Team Alpha reports successful penetration of the command complex. Zarakai's voice came through the communicator. Enemy leadership eliminated. Beginning final phase destruction. Strike Team Beta has completed primary demolition objectives, Thekron reported. Manufacturing capability destroyed. Beginning extraction. Strike Team Gamma encountered heavier resistance than expected, Velterra reported. But charges are placed and armed. Withdrawing now. Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of a plan executing exactly as designed. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in 50,000 years, but his enhanced memory recalled it perfectly. This was what he had been created for. The planning and execution of complex military operations that required perfect coordination of multiple elements. All strike teams, you have 15 minutes to reach minimum safe distance, he announced. Demolition charges will detonate simultaneously at Mark plus 30. The withdrawal phase was always the most dangerous part of any assault operation. The enemy would be responding to the attacks now, sending every available unit to the industrial facilities. The strike teams had to cover several kilometers of open desert while avoiding the hunter-killer teams that would be deployed to intercept them. Enemy response teams converging on all 3 targets, Kethmar reported. Estimate arrival at primary facility in 12 minutes. Strike teams are moving faster than projected, came reports from the field commanders. Should reach minimum safe distance with time to spare. Marcus nodded, but he wasn't relaxing yet. The operation wouldn't be complete until every warrior was safely back in the deep desert, and the charges had detonated. Too many missions failed in the final moments because commanders became overconfident. Mark plus 25, he announced. All teams should be at minimum safe distance. Strike Team Alpha confirms safe extraction, Zarakai reported. Strike Team Beta clear, and moving to secondary extraction point, Thekron added. Strike Team Gamma. Valterra's voice was interrupted by the sound of weapons fire. Taking fire from pursuit teams. Will reach minimum safe distance, but requesting covering fire from diversionary elements. Marcus immediately shifted tactical displays to show the area around the third facility. Diversionary Team 7, you have Strike Team extraction in your area. Provide covering fire and harassment to enemy pursuit. Confirmed. Moving to support extraction. The chronometer showed Mark plus 29. 1 minute until detonation. All teams confirm minimum safe distance, came to reports from field commanders. 30 seconds, Marcus announced. He watched the displays showing enemy forces converging on all 3 industrial facilities. Thousands of void-touched warriors were moving through areas that were about to become the center of massive explosions. 10 seconds. The communication channels fell silent as every warrior across the planet waited for the moment that would announce the success or failure of the most ambitious operation in their history. Mark, the explosions were visible from orbit. 3 simultaneous detonations lit up the night sky as fusion reactors, manufacturing equipment, and command centers disappeared in columns of fire and plasma. The seismic sensors in the command center registered the shock waves as they propagated across the planet's surface. For a moment, the communication channels remained silent as the full scope of what they had achieved sank in. Then, the reports began flooding in. Primary facility completely destroyed, Zarakai reported. No significant structures remaining. Secondary facility eliminated, Thekron confirmed. Manufacturing capacity reduced to 0. Third facility destroyed, Valterra added. Estimate enemy communication capability reduced by 60%. But Marcus was watching something else on his displays. The enemy response patterns were shifting, changing from the predictable doctrine they had followed for 10 millennia. The Void-Touch Central Command was adapting to the new threat faster than he had expected. All diversionary teams begin immediate withdrawal, he ordered. The enemy is shifting to a new tactical pattern. They're going to try to trap our forces in place while they bring up heavier units. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. In one night, the Kalari had achieved more than they had in the previous century of guerrilla warfare. They had proven that the void-touched could be hurt, that their defenses could be penetrated, and that coordinated assault could overcome superior numbers. More importantly, they had proven that Marcus Chen's tactical genius was not diminished by 50,000 years of stasis. The Ancient One had delivered on his promises, and now 10,000 warriors looked to him not just with hope, but with the absolute confidence that came from serving under a commander who knew how to win. As the reports continued to come in, and the full scope of their victory became clear, Marcus was already planning their next operation. The industrial facilities were destroyed, but the enemy would rebuild. Unless, of course, they no longer controlled the resources necessary for reconstruction. It was time to take the next step in the reconquest of Hope's End. It was time to attack the cities themselves. The success of the industrial facility raids had changed everything. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Void-Touched were on the defensive, their production capabilities crippled, and their tactical doctrine shattered by an enemy who refused to follow the predictable patterns of guerrilla warfare. Marcus stood in the expanded command center, watching intelligence reports flow in from across the planet. The enemy was rebuilding, but slowly and cautiously. They had tripled the guard forces at their remaining installations and begun implementing random patrol patterns that made their movements harder to predict. More importantly, they were requesting reinforcements from off-world. The quantum communication interceptors that the Kalari had developed over the centuries were picking up transmissions to the Greater Void-Touched Collective, requests for additional troops, and resources to deal with what they were now calling the Terran Resurgence. "They remember us," Marcus said to himself, studying the intercepted communications. The Void-Touched didn't just see the Kalari as another resistance movement. They recognized the tactical patterns, the strategic thinking, the particular brand of relentless aggression that had made humanity feared across the galaxy 50,000 years ago. Ancient One, Zarakai approached him with a collection of data tablets. "The reconnaissance reports you requested." Marcus accepted the tablets, each one containing detailed intelligence on the 3 major population centers that remained under Void-Touch control. The largest city, Kethmoran, had been the planetary capital before the invasion and now served as the primary command center for the entire occupation force. The other 2, Velton and Zakris, controlled vital resource extraction operations and transportation networks. Estimated enemy strength? Marcus asked without looking up from the reports. Kethmoran, approximately 15,000 warrior forms plus support entities. Veltron, 8,000. Zakris, 7,000. Total of 30,000 combat units across all 3 cities. And civilian populations? Zarakai's expression darkened. Unknown, but our intelligence suggests significant numbers of enslaved population being used for labor and resource extraction. Kalari who were captured during the early years of occupation, plus members of several other species that were brought here as workers. That complicated things. Marcus had hoped the cities would be purely military targets, but urban warfare was always messy when civilian populations were involved. He couldn't simply level the cities with orbital bombardment, even if they had possessed that capability. "Show me the defensive layouts." The holographic displays shifted to show detailed maps of each city. Kethmoran was a maze of defensive positions and fortified structures, with the enemy command center protected by overlapping fields of fire and multiple redundant defensive systems. Veltaran and Zakris were smaller but more concentrated, their defenses focused on protecting critical resource extraction facilities. Traditional assault doctrine would require at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to take urban positions this heavily defended. Thekron observed from where he stood studying the displays. "We're facing the exact opposite ratio." Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on something else, the transportation networks connecting the 3 cities. Maglev lines that had once carried civilian traffic now served as supply routes for the occupation forces. Underground utility tunnels that had been built to service the original colonial settlements. Communication networks that linked all 3 population centers into a single integrated command structure. "They're not 3 separate cities," he said slowly. "They're one distributed installation with 3 major nodes. Take out the connections between them, and each node becomes isolated and vulnerable." "Ancient One," Zarakai asked. Marcus highlighted the transportation networks on the display. "Look at their logistics. Food, fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, personnel rotation. Everything flows between these cities through predictable routes that they've been using for centuries. They've never had to worry about protecting their supply lines because no one has ever been able to threaten them. Until now," Thekron said, beginning to understand. "Until now? We're not going to assault the cities directly. We're going to cut them off from each other, then strangle them slowly while they starve." Marcus began highlighting targets on the display. Transportation hubs, communication relays, supply depots, fuel storage facilities. Phase 1. Systematic destruction of the infrastructure connecting the 3 cities. We make them isolated islands in hostile territory. Phase 2, asked Velterra, who had joined them in the command center. Phase 2. We make it impossible for them to maintain their positions. Constant harassment, supply interdiction, psychological warfare. We turn occupation duty into a nightmare that breaks their morale and forces them to make mistakes. And Phase 3, Marcus smiled, and several of the commanders felt that familiar chill. Phase 3. We take the cities one at a time, using the forces from each capture position to help us take the next one. By the time we assault the capital, we'll outnumber the defenders instead of the other way around. The plan was ambitious beyond anything the Kalari had ever contemplated. It required not just tactical victories, but strategic patience, the kind of long-term thinking that looked beyond individual battles to the ultimate goal of planetary liberation. How long do you estimate for complete execution? Zarakai asked. 6 months for Phase 1. Another 6 months for Phase 2. Phase 3. Marcus studied the defensive layouts of the capital city. That depends on how well we execute the first 2 phases. If we do this right, Kethmorin could fall in a matter of days. And if we do it wrong, we'll be back where we started, except the enemy will be prepared for our tactics. This only works if we execute perfectly at every stage. Over the next several weeks, Marcus threw himself into planning with the intensity that had made him legendary during humanity's golden age. He studied every aspect of the enemy's logistics networks, their communication protocols, their personnel rotation schedules. He analyzed 10,000 years of intelligence data, looking for patterns and weaknesses that the Kalari might have missed. The infrastructure attacks began 3 weeks later. Unlike the industrial facility raids, these were smaller operations designed to be executed continuously over a period of months. Teams of 20 to 50 warriors would strike a target, destroy it completely, and disappear back into the desert before the enemy could respond. The first targets were the most isolated transportation nodes, places where a single bridge or tunnel controlled access to vast stretches of supply line. Destroying these created immediate disruptions that forced the enemy to reroute supplies through less efficient channels. Maglev Junction 7 destroyed, came the report from the first strike team. Rail transport between Kethmorin and Veltarun reduced by 40%. Communication relay Delta 7 eliminated, reported another team. Enemy forced to rely on backup channels for coordination between northern and western sectors. Fuel depot at grid reference 447 to 221 destroyed, added a third. Enemy reserves in the Veltarun region reduced by approximately 25%. Each individual attack was a pinprick, barely noticeable in the context of the enemy's overall operational capability. But Marcus was thinking like a surgeon, making precise cuts that would slowly bleed the patient while appearing to do minimal damage. The Void Touched responded exactly as he had predicted. They increased security at the remaining infrastructure targets, but couldn't protect everything simultaneously. They tried to rebuild destroyed facilities, but the construction teams became targets themselves. They attempted to establish new supply routes, but these were predictable and vulnerable to interdiction. Most importantly, they began pulling troops from other duties to provide security for their logistics networks. Guard forces that should have been protecting the cities themselves were instead spread across hundreds of kilometers of vulnerable infrastructure. Enemy troop concentrations in all 3 cities down by approximately 15%, intelligence reported after the first month of operations. They're dispersing their forces to protect supply lines. Perfect, Marcus replied. Continue current operations. I want their logistics capability reduced by 60% before we move to Phase 2. The attacks continued with mechanical precision. Every few days, another critical component of the enemy supply network would disappear in a precisely targeted explosion. Transportation hubs, communication centers, fuel depots, manufacturing facilities that produce spare parts for vehicles and equipment. The psychological effect was as important as the material damage. The Void Touched had controlled this planet for 10 millennia without facing a sustained campaign of infrastructure warfare. Now, they were forced to live with constant uncertainty, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. Their patrol patterns are becoming increasingly erratic, Zarakai reported after the second month of operations. They're showing signs of the same kind of stress behavior we documented in their forces during the early years after the invasion. Good. Scared enemies make mistakes. Tired enemies make even more mistakes. The breakthrough came during the third month of Phase 1, when a reconnaissance team discovered that the enemy had begun using civilian transport to move military supplies. The maglev systems were too vulnerable to attack, so they were mixing military cargo with enslaved worker transport to make targeting more difficult. They're using human shields, Velterra reported with disgust, putting weapons and ammunition on the same trains as captured civilians. Marcus studied the intelligence reports for several minutes, his enhanced mind working through the tactical implications. This was exactly the kind of adaptation he had been expecting, but it still complicated the operational picture. Change of tactics, he announced. No more attacks on mixed civilian-military targets. We focus exclusively on pure military logistics from now on. That will reduce our target selection by approximately 50%, Thekron pointed out. Yes, but it will also force them to continue using the civilian transportation system for military supplies, which means we can track their supply movements by monitoring civilian transport schedules. The subtle shift in tactics had exactly the effect Marcus had predicted. The enemy began to rely heavily on civilian transportation systems, thinking they were safe from attack. But this also made their supply movements more predictable and easier to monitor. They're moving ammunition to Velterun using the morning's civilian transport, intelligence reported. Same schedule every 3 days. And fuel supplies to Zakris on the evening's civilian runs, added another analyst. Marcus studied the transportation schedules, looking for the pattern that would give him the opening he needed. The enemy was protecting their supplies by hiding them among civilian populations, but they were also concentrating their logistics operations into predictable windows of time. I want interdiction operations scheduled for the gaps between civilian transports, he ordered. We hit their pure military convoys while leaving the civilian traffic untouched. Make them choose between protecting their supplies and protecting the enslaved population. The strategy worked better than he had hoped. The enemy was forced to either accept constant losses to their military supply convoys or increase security to levels that made civilian transportation impossible. Either choice worked in favor of the Kalari objectives. By the end of the fourth month, enemy logistics capability had been reduced by exactly the 60% that Marcus had targeted. The 3 cities were still connected, but barely. Supply convoys traveled under heavy guard and were frequently delayed or rerouted due to security concerns. More importantly, the enemy garrison forces were showing clear signs of strain. Their communication networks were operating at reduced efficiency. Their equipment maintenance suffered from lack of spare parts. Their morale was being ground down by months of constant alerts and failed attempts to protect vulnerable supply lines. Phase 1 objectives achieved. Marcus announced to the assembled Legion commanders. Enemy logistics degraded beyond minimum operational requirements. All 3 cities are now vulnerable to sustained siege operations. And Phase 2? Zarakai asked. Marcus looked at the tactical displays showing enemy positions across the planet. 3 isolated cities, their connections to each other tenuous and heavily defended. Garrison forces that were tired, frustrated, and increasingly paranoid about when and where the next attack would come. Phase 2 begins tomorrow, he said. It's time to make their lives truly miserable. Phase 2 began with a demonstration that would be remembered in Kalari legend for generations to come. Marcus had chosen the smallest of the 3 cities, Zakris, for the opening gambit of what he privately called the education of the void touched. The city controlled a series of mining operations that provided rare materials essential for maintaining the enemy's advanced technology. More importantly, its relatively small garrison of 7,000 warrior forms made it the perfect testing ground for tactics that would later be applied to the larger population centers. Today we teach them the difference between occupation and siege, Marcus announced to his assembled commanders as they reviewed the final operational plans. For 10,000 years, they've been sitting comfortably in our cities, using our infrastructure, consuming our resources. That ends now. The first phase of the siege was psychological. Marcus had learned during humanity's wars that defeating an enemy's will to fight was often more effective than destroying their ability to fight. The Void Touched had grown complacent during their long occupation, and he intended to shatter that complacency completely. It began with the water supply. Zachris depended on an aquifer that was accessed through 6 major pumping stations located outside the city's defensive perimeter. Rather than destroying the stations, Marcus ordered his engineers to contaminate the water supply with harmless but detectable biological agents that would make it taste and smell terrible while remaining technically safe to drink. The enemy has redundant filtration systems, Velterra had pointed out during planning. They can probably clean the water supply within a few days. They can, Marcus had agreed. But cleaning water requires resources, time, and personnel. More importantly, it forces them to question the safety of their most basic necessities. Nothing breaks morale faster than uncertainty about food and water. The contamination worked exactly as planned. Within hours of the first affected water reaching the city, the enemy garrison was dealing with a crisis that their tactical doctrine had no provisions for handling. They could clean the water, but doing so required diverting personnel and resources from defensive duties. While the enemy struggled with their water problems, Marcus launched the second phase of the psychological campaign, constant harassment designed to prevent rest and relaxation among the garrison forces. Small teams of Kalari snipers took positions in the hills surrounding Zachris, just outside the effective range of the city's defensive weapons. They didn't attack military targets directly. Instead, they focused on creating an atmosphere of constant threat that made normal operations impossible. Communication antennas were severed with precisely aimed shots at random intervals throughout the day and night. Exterior lighting systems were methodically destroyed, forcing the enemy to operate under degraded visibility conditions. Sensor arrays were damaged just enough to create blind spots without triggering major alarm responses. The enemy is responding to harassment operations by increasing patrol frequency. Intelligence reported after the first week of Phase 2 operations. They're running 3 times as many external security sweeps as normal, which means their personnel are getting 1/3 the normal amount of rest. Marcus replied with satisfaction. Tired soldiers make mistakes, and we're going to be ready to exploit every mistake they make. The third element of the psychological campaign was the most subtle, but perhaps the most effective. Marcus had ordered his communication specialist to begin broadcasting human military music and historical speeches on frequencies that he knew the Void-touched monitoring equipment would intercept. The broadcasts weren't intended to carry tactical information. They were meant to remind the enemy exactly who they were fighting. Recordings of ancient Terra's greatest military leaders. Battle songs that had been sung by human soldiers across 100 different worlds. Historical accounts of humanity's greatest victories against impossible odds. Let them remember, Marcus said when Zarakai questioned the purpose of the broadcasts. Let them remember why their predecessors feared humans enough to make our extinction a strategic priority. The effect was subtle, but measurable. The Void-touched had controlled this world for 10 millennia, but their collective memory went back much further. They remembered the wars that had raged across the galaxy when humanity was still expanding among the stars. They remembered the tactical innovations, the strategic brilliance, the absolute refusal to surrender that had made humans the most dangerous opponent the Void-touched collective had ever faced. Now they were facing that same enemy again, and the psychological impact was significant. Enemy communication traffic has increased by 40%, the intelligence teams reported. They're requesting strategic guidance from higher command authorities, asking for historical tactical analysis, requesting additional psychological warfare countermeasures. Translation, they're scared, Thekron observed. They know they're not just fighting the Kalari anymore. They're fighting the ghost of Terra itself. But Marcus wasn't relying solely on psychological warfare. While the harassment operations continued, He was positioning forces for the next phase of the siege, systematic destruction of everything that made occupation of the city profitable or sustainable. The mining operations outside Zakris were protected by their own defensive installations, but these were designed to repel frontal assault rather than the kind of precision demolition that had become the Kalari specialty. Small teams of engineers infiltrated the mining sites during shift changes, when security was focused on managing the enslaved workforce rather than watching for external threats. Mining Complex Alpha destroyed, came the first report. Rare Earth extraction capabilities reduced by 30%. Complex Beta eliminated, followed another team. Reactor fuel production shut down indefinitely. Complex Gamma hit but not destroyed, reported a third team. Enemy response was faster than anticipated. Recommend waiting for security to relax before making another attempt. One by one, the economic justifications for maintaining a garrison at Zakris disappeared in carefully orchestrated explosions. The Void-Touched found themselves protecting a city that was rapidly becoming a net drain on their resources rather than a productive asset. More importantly, the destruction of the mining operations served a strategic purpose beyond immediate economic damage. It freed the enslaved workforce that the enemy had been using to operate the extraction facilities. Approximately 3,000 liberated prisoners, Zarakai reported after the mining operations were shut down. Mixed population of Kalari and several other species. Most are in poor physical condition, but could potentially be integrated into support roles. Get them to the deep desert installations, Marcus ordered. Full medical care, proper nutrition, and voluntary recruitment for anyone who wants to join the resistance. But no pressure. They've suffered enough. The liberation of the enslaved workers was both a humanitarian success and a tactical advantage. Many of the former prisoners had detailed knowledge of void-touched operations, security procedures, and defensive capabilities. Their intelligence proved invaluable for planning the next phases of the siege. The enemy garrison is showing signs of significant stress, reported one of the liberated workers who had agreed to provide intelligence briefings. They've been on high alert for weeks now, and their command staff is struggling to maintain discipline among the troops. What about their supply situation? Marcus asked. Getting worse every day. The contaminated water supply forced them to bring infiltration equipment from the other cities. The destruction of the mining operations means they're not generating any revenue to justify the cost of maintaining the garrison. And the constant harassment means they're expending ammunition and equipment faster than normal. Marcus nodded, studying the intelligence reports. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The enemy garrison was isolated, demoralized, and increasingly vulnerable. It was time for Phase 3. Signal all Legion commanders, he ordered. We begin the final assault on Zakris in 72 hours. This will be our first test of urban assault tactics. Everything we learn here will be applied to taking the larger cities. The final assault began before dawn on the 70th day of the siege. Unlike the previous operations, this was a conventional military attack designed to overwhelm the enemy's defensive positions through superior tactics and concentrated firepower. Marcus had divided his assault force into 3 prongs, each one targeting a different section of the city's defensive perimeter. The attack was timed to coincide with a shift change among the enemy garrison, when command and control would be at its most vulnerable. First prong reports penetration of outer defensive line. Thekron reported from his position commanding the primary assault force, encountering lighter resistance than anticipated. Second prong has breached the industrial sector, Valterra added. Enemy response is disorganized. They appear to be having difficulty coordinating their defensive efforts. Third prong encountering heavy resistance at the command center, Zarakai reported. But their defensive fire is poorly aimed. They seem to be suffering from fatigue and stress. Marcus watched the tactical displays as his carefully planned assault unfolded across the city. Months of siege warfare had done exactly what he had intended. Broken the enemies will to fight before the real battle even began. The psychological preparation, the infrastructure degradation, the constant harassment, and the systematic destruction of everything that made the city valuable had left the void-touched garrison in no condition to mount an effective defense. They were tired, demoralized, undersupplied, and facing an enemy who knew exactly how to exploit every weakness. Central Command Complex secured. Zarakai reported 6 hours after the assault began. Enemy leadership eliminated. Remaining garrison forces are surrendering or attempting to flee. City center under our control, Thekron added. Enemy resistance has collapsed completely. Industrial sectors secured, Velterra confirmed. We control all critical infrastructure. Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of a perfectly executed operation. The siege of Zakris had taken 73 days from beginning to end, and resulted in the complete elimination of a 7,000-strong enemy garrison with minimal casualties among his own forces. But more importantly, they now controlled city. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Kalari held urban terrain that they could use as a base for future operations. Casualty reports? Marcus asked. 47 warriors killed, 112 wounded, came the reply. Enemy casualties. Approximately 6,800 killed, 200 captured. The mathematics were staggering. His forces had achieved a kill ratio of nearly 150 to 1 while successfully capturing and holding enemy territory. It was the kind of tactical success that military academies would study for centuries. What's our next objective? Zarakai asked as the reports continued to flow in from across the captured city. Marcus looked at the tactical displays showing the remaining 2 enemy-controlled cities. Veltron, with its 8,000 defenders and critical resource extraction operations, and Kethmorand, the capital, with 15,000 enemy troops and the primary command center for the entire planetary occupation. We rest, refit, and integrate the lessons learned here, he said. Then, we apply the same siege tactics to Veltron, except this time we'll have urban support facilities and captured enemy equipment to work with. And after Veltron, Marcus smiled, and every commander present felt that familiar chill of anticipation. After Velteron, we take the capital, and when Kethmorand falls, we'll have liberated the first world in 10,000 years to successfully throw off void-touched occupation. And then? Thekron asked. Then we take this war to the stars. We liberate other worlds. We build a new human empire from the ashes of the old one. We show the galaxy that humanity isn't extinct. We were just sleeping. Marcus looked out at the captured city of Zakris, where Kalari warriors were already beginning the work of restoring civilian infrastructure and treating the liberated population. It was the first free human city in 10 millennia, and it wouldn't be the last. The Void Touched had controlled the galaxy for far too long. They had grown comfortable in their dominance, believing that the destruction of Terra and the scattering of the human colonies had ended the threat of human resistance forever. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. Marcus Chun, last son of Terra, had awakened from 50,000 years of sleep to find himself in command of 10,000 warriors who had never learned how to surrender. Together, they were going to remind the galaxy why humans had once been the most feared species among the stars. The reconquest of Hope's End was just the beginning. When it was complete, they would carry their war to every world the Void Touched controlled, liberating enslaved populations and rebuilding the human civilization that should never have been allowed to fall. The stars themselves would remember the day that humanity returned to claim its destiny. And the Void Touched would learn, as so many enemies had learned before them, that humans never stayed down for long.